The bombardment had turned the Kelhari nursery into a graveyard of twisted metal and burning polymer. Lyra crouched behind what remained of a support column, her combat medical pack digging into her shoulders as another explosion rocked the compound. Through the acrid smoke, she could hear them, the high-pitched keening of the cubs trapped in the eastern wing. Every species in the Galactic Coalition had protocols for evacuations. Every species except humans followed them. Medic Chen, fall back to the rally point, Commander Voss's voice crackled through her comm. That's an order. Lyra didn't respond. She was already moving. The Kelhari were a proud warrior race, their adults standing 3 meters tall with crystalline bone structures that could deflect plasma fire. But their young were fragile, their exoskeletons soft as silk until their third molt. When the Hurricane fleet had punched through the orbital defenses, the adult Kelhari had formed a perimeter, buying time for the evacuation ships. They'd held the line magnificently. They'd also left their cubs behind, not out of cruelty. Kelhari military doctrine was clear. Adults were soldiers. Cubs were acceptable losses in the calculus of survival. The species would endure. It always had, Lyra had heard the doctrine. She'd nodded politely during the briefing. Then she'd grabbed her medical kit and headed toward the screaming. The Eastern Wing's entrance had collapsed, but humans were excellent at finding ways into places they weren't supposed to be. Lyra squeezed through a gap in the rubble that would have been impossible for any Kelhari adult, her smaller frame an advantage for once. Inside, emergency lighting flickered like dying stars, casting dancing shadows across walls decorated with what she'd learned were Kelhari educational murals. Spiral galaxies and mathematical constants rendered in bioluminescent paint. Cubs, she called out in halting Kelhari. I'm here to help. The keening stopped. In the sudden silence, Lyra heard the ragged breathing of the injured, the crackle of fires and the distant thunder of orbital strikes. Then from behind an overturned learning pod, a small voice spoke. You are human? Lyra rounded the pod and found them. 7 cubs, their translucent carapaces cracked and bleeding the silver-blue ichor of their species. The smallest couldn't have been more than 2 solar cycles old. The one who'd spoken, slightly larger with the beginning of warrior ridge formations along his spine, watched her with eyes that reflected light like prisms. I'm Lyra, she said, kneeling. I'm a medic. I'm going to get you out. The doctrine says, I know what the doctrine says. Lyra was already opening her kit, pulling out biogel packets calibrated for Kelhari physiology. Human medical science had learned to adapt. The doctrine is wrong. She worked quickly, sealing the worst of the cracks, stabilizing bleeding, speaking in soft tones that she'd learned worked across species barriers. The cubs watched her with something between wonder and confusion. In their short lives, they'd been taught that only the strong survived, that individual sacrifice ensured species survival. They'd never met a human before. What's your name? Lyra asked the larger cub as she wrapped his fractured forelimb. Thorn, he whispered. I am Thorn of Clutch 17. Well, Thorn of Clutch 17, I need your help. She gestured to the smallest cub, who was drifting into shock. Can you carry her? I'll take 3, you take her, and the other 3 stay close. Thorn's crystalline eyes widened. I am injured. The doctrine says you're acceptable losses. I say you're coming home. Lyra looked at each of them in turn. All of you. That's not negotiable. Another explosion, closer this time. Dust rained from the ceiling. Lyra scooped up 2 of the smaller cubs, secured a third in an emergency harness across her chest, and nodded to Thorn. Now. They moved through the smoke like ghosts, Lyra's thermal visor guiding them through collapsed corridors and burning rooms. Twice they had to hide as Hurricane scouts passed overhead, their anti-grav platforms humming. Twice Lyra held her breath and clutched the cubs closer, feeling their rapid heartbeats against her armor. The smallest cub, the one Thorn carried, stopped breathing in the maintenance tunnel. No, Thorn whispered, his voice breaking. No, she... Lyra was there in an instant, lowering the cub to the ground, beginning compressions. Human hands on a Kelhari chest, pumping to a rhythm learned in a medical bay light years from Earth. 1 minute, 2, 3. The cub gasped. Ichor bubbling from her mouth and began to breathe. Move, Lyra commanded. And Thorn moved. They emerged from the compound into chaos. The extraction point was hot. Plasma fire stitching patterns across the sky as coalition fighters dueled with Hurricane interceptors. The transport ships were already lifting off, their holds full of Kelhari warriors. "Medical transport, this is Chen," Lyra shouted into her comm. "I have 7 civilian casualties, priority evac." "Chen, those transports are at capacity. Then make room." Perhaps it was the steel in her voice. Perhaps it was because human medics had a reputation for being slightly insane. Or perhaps it was because every species in the coalition had learned that when a human said they were bringing someone home, they meant it. A transport descended, its loading ramp already extending. Commander Voss stood at the top, his 4 arms crossed in the Kelhari gesture of profound disapproval. "Medic Chen, you disobeyed direct orders." "Yes, sir." Lyra climbed the ramp, cubs clinging to her armor. Thorn followed, still carrying the smallest. Voss looked at the cubs, looked at Lyra. His crystalline features were unreadable, but when he spoke, his voice was soft. "The doctrine is being revised," came a voice from inside the transport. Elder Matriarch Kess emerged from the shadows, her ancient carapace scarred from 100 battles. She looked at the 7 cubs, at the human medic who'd refused to leave them, and something shifted in her prismatic eyes. "We Kelhari have survived for 10,000 cycles through strength and sacrifice," Kess said slowly. "We have never considered that strength might also mean refusing to sacrifice." She touched Lyra's shoulder with surprising gentleness. "Perhaps we have something to learn from humans after all." The transport lifted off as the compound collapsed behind them, consumed by fire. Lyra sat against the bulkhead, exhausted, 7 Kelhari cubs pressed against her. Thorn looked up at her, his young voice filled with something that might have been awe. "Why?" he asked. "Why did you come back for us?" Lyra closed her eyes, feeling the familiar weight of the oath she'd taken when she'd become a medic. The same oath that humans had carried across the stars, stubborn and defiant and absolutely unwilling to accept that any life was acceptable loss. "Because," she said simply, "I'm human. We don't leave people behind." In the darkness of the transport, surrounded by warriors who'd been taught that only the strong survive, 7 cubs learned a new doctrine. Humanity had come to the stars, and the galaxy would never be the same.